On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers marched from Siberia to Manchukuo. What is surprising is not the scale of the attack, but how long it took for these two countries to finally come to grips with each other. After all, Japan was the Third Reich's most powerful ally and the Soviet Union was Nazi Germany's natural enemy. In this video we are going to analyze the causes of this, in a story that involves Mongolian soldiers on horseback, secret international strategies, and a spy who loves women and alcohol, who changed the history of the 20th century like no other. Join us to find out why Japan didn't help Germany destroy the Soviet Union. To tell this story we have to go back to the beginning, but not of World War II, but rather before, to 1931. At that time, Japan was in an institutional crisis, and one of its forces decided to advance on Manchuria, a territory to the North China bordering southern Russia. The Chinese fought, but by February 1932 the province was under Japanese control. Not satisfied with controlling this new region, called Manchukuo, the Japanese decided to advance into Soviet territory, a long and drawn-out conflict that became known as the Soviet-Japanese Border Wars. The first clashes occurred between Japanese soldiers and Mongolian mounted troops, allied with Moscow. The Japanese Manchukuo army was confident, but they were met by a tide of well-armed Mongols with millennia of experience in mounted warfare. The Japanese defeat was devastating, they lost almost half their men in a span of weeks. They responded by sending a few hundred soldiers and tanks, which temporarily balanced the scales. The decisive battle in the Soviet-Japanese border war was fought between July and August 1939. The clash occurred near the Jalja River, on the border between Soviet Mongolia and Manchukuo. The Japanese officers decided to launch a full-scale attack before they were outnumbered by the Soviet Mongolian troops. The attack consisted of a mobilization of 4 full regiments escorted by 100 tanks and tankettes that crossed the Jalja River. The Soviets were hit hard, losing troops and equipment, but the Japanese lines were too far apart, putting the Japanese army in a vulnerable position. In August, the Soviets launched their counterattack under the command of the greatest military strategist in the history of the Soviet Union, General Zhukov. To give you a scale of how powerful this counterattack was, keep in mind that 3 tank brigades, 2 mechanized brigades, 2 Mongolian mounted divisions and over 550 aircraft were mobilized from the Soviet side. Sure, the Japanese forces were virtually wiped out, though those who survived refused to surrender and, thanks to a solid defense, did not allow Zhukov's men to advance into Manchukuo. In 1939, the turf war between the Soviet Union and Japan seemed headed for a Russian victory, but something happened between the night of August 23 and the early morning of August 24. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. The document, signed in Moscow 9 days before the start of World War II, called for an end to hostilities between the Soviet Union and Germany and then to divide up Poland as war booty. This meant that even if they got along badly, the Soviets and Japanese became temporary allies, at least until German-Russian hatred put an end to the pact. During this period of apparent peace, the Japanese took the opportunity to rebuild their devastated military force in the North China region. New trucks, new tanks and thousands of young soldiers were incorporated, transforming the force into one of the best prepared in the Japanese Empire. Beyond the political and institutional crisis that Japan was going through, with the army and the navy facing each other for years, the possibility of invading Siberia remained latent. Russia knew this, which is why it maintained a presence of more than 1 million soldiers and hundreds of tanks in the south of its territory. Each side expected the other to make the first hostile move in the typical calm before the storm. It was then that a man came into play who put an end to that balance. Richard Sorge was a German spy who had worked for the Soviet forces since 1933. Stalin's government tasked him with finding information on Axis strategies in Asia, so Sorge enlisted in the Nazi Party and befriended many official Nazi journalists of great importance. This is how he got a journalistic job as a special envoy in Japan. There, Sorge became the best spy in modern history, completely changing the course of the conflict. Such was his deceit that, before leaving Germany, he threw a farewell party attended by Joseph Goebbels himself. Once in Asia, Sorge's main objective was to find out how possible a Japanese invasion of Siberia was. How is this accomplished? Easy, assuming a false identity, befriending a high-ranking German officer in Japan, and seducing his wife into telling him all of her husband's secrets. The German officer in question was General Eugene Ott, with whom Sorge had breakfast practically every day. If the spy didn't get what he needed over breakfast, he continued his investigation in the afternoon with Helma, General Ott's wife. Sorge was a nice guy, he knew how to handle alcohol, and he used to get drunk with Nazi officials who were quick to confide important secrets to him. All that information was sent non-stop to Moscow. Sorge sent so much data that even the Soviets had their suspicions. How did this drunk man manage to deceive dozens of German officers? The Russians thought that Sorge made up much of the reporting on him, but this was not the case. In May 1941, Sorge sent one of the most important messages of his life: expect the start of a German attack on the Soviet Union in mid-June. Reading the message, Stalin laughed out loud. But Sorge's prediction was wrong by just 1 week. Surely Stalin didn't laugh so enthusiastically when Operation Barbarossa began. The Soviets learned the hard way that Sorge's information was accurate. In September 1941, Sorge warned that Japan would not advance into Siberia until Moscow was captured by Germany and Japanese forces had numerical and material superiority over Russia. These conditions implied that Japan was not willing to sacrifice too much in North China. This meant that the Soviet Union could send millions of men stationed in Siberia into the heart of Europe, where the bloodiest fighting was taking place. These reinforcements were vital to prevent the German advance into Russia and thus to the Allied triumph in World War II. This probably makes Sorge's spy work the most important of the 20th century. But spies don't live very long, and Sorge was no exception. The last message from him was sent in October 1941, in which he sent calm to Moscow, assuring that a Japanese attack on the region was practically impossible. Sorge was captured a few days later by the secret police of Japan. He limited himself to confessing that he was a spy and ironically listed all the German strata that he managed to deceive for years. Finally, he was executed in November 1944. In 1964, he was declared a hero of the Soviet Union, with a gigantic statue commemorating his work. This is the story of why Japan never launched an attack on the Soviet Union, and how a man who loved alcohol and women became the linchpin of Moscow's campaign in Europe and Asia. If you like to know stories like this, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. We say goodbye until the next installment of Military History.